You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Kudlak.
Hello and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Kudlak, one of the hosts of the podcast, and I'm joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox.
Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited. If you see the title, you already know, but it is National Nurses Day. So I'm excited to have a burn nurse on as our guest and, just spread all the love to all the nurses in the world.
Absolutely. Happy National Nurses Day. Well, before we get started, we always like to say a special thanks to our sponsor for today's episode. So, Rachel, could you go ahead and introduce us to today's sponsor?
Yes. So today's podcast is powered by Johns Hopkins Medicine. The mission of Johns Hopkins Medicine is to improve the health of the community and the world by setting the standard of excellence in medical education, research, and clinical care. And you can learn more by visiting hopkinsmedicine.org.
Yes, special thanks to Johns Hopkins today. It's a mouthful for me. Yes, it is National Nurses Day. So really excited to have you introduce our next guest, Rachel. If you could introduce her so we can bring her on, that'd be great.
Yes. So today we have a guest who's very familiar with our podcast sponsor. Emily Werthman is the burn program coordinator of the Johns Hopkins Burn Center, where she has been a nurse since 2012. A graduate of the Allegheny College Nursing Program, she also holds a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as a BSN and MSN from the University of Notre Dame of Maryland. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, where she studies the relationship between acute burn pain and childhood adversity. Emily is the lead nurse planner for the American Burn Association, where she also holds a national committee appointment to the nursing committee. She's a subject matter expert, item writer, and exam content review committee member for the Board of Certification for Emergency Nursing Certified Burn Nurse CBRN exam. She also serves as a member of the BCEN's Board of Directors and was recently appointed a special advisor to the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority Burn and Blast Injury Special Advisory Group. On top of all of that, she also holds an adjunct faculty positions in the Johns Hopkins and Stevenson University Schools of Nursing. She publishes and lectures frequently on burn resuscitation, critical care nursing, and burn pain. So thank you so much, Emily, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, to get started, sorry, Amber, I think you may be on mute. Go ahead.
I was getting ready to talk. Again, clearly I got sleep last night with my son, but I'm still struggling here today. So maybe I got too much sleep. Emily, so thank you for joining us. To get started, we'd love to learn more about kind of how you got involved in the burn community. We usually start off by just learning and telling those that are listening or watching us today kind of why we had you on the podcast as, advocates and of our community. So if you could start there, that'd be great.
Sure. So as Rachel mentioned, my first degree was in history. So I went to college fully thinking I was going to be a history teacher because I was one of those girls who grew up thinking that I wasn't any good at science and math. And history was something I loved. And so I thought that's what I would do. And so I graduated college and started working, doing writing for some nonprofit groups, and thinking about maybe going back and getting a master's degree in education so I could teach. And during that time after college, I was kind of figuring out what I was going to do. I was doing some grant writing, some event planning, kind of working in the nonprofit space. I got a call one night from a police officer in North Carolina letting me know that my mother had been in a house fire and that she had died as a result of the house fire. And so that would tend to make someone reevaluate their life choices a little bit. And I had been working, as I said, in the nonprofit space and really loved working with the clients that I was working with. I worked for a great organization here in Baltimore called the League for People with Disabilities. And that was always the highlight of my day, was going in and working with the clients that were in our adult medical day program. And so I thought, maybe this is what I should really be thinking about doing, is working in a space with people and doing more than just writing the grants and planning the fundraisers, and really working with people. And the more I thought about it, and the more kind of honestly survivor's guilt I had about my mom dying and me not being there, and thinking about that and how she wasn't alone when she died. She was with burn nurses. And I thought maybe that would be a great thing for me to do for someone else's family, to make sure that burn patients were cared for in the way that my mom was cared for, and in the way that we care for patients here at the Johns Hopkins Burn Center. So that's kind of how I got involved in burn nursing. So I went back to school, got a bachelor's degree in nursing and then a master's degree, and now I'm just getting ready to defend my dissertation for my PhD here in a couple weeks. So yeah, it's a great community, and I'm in some ways, I was sorry that that's how I got into it. Obviously, losing my mom was traumatic and horrible and all those things, but it's really provided kind of a framework for doing good for me. And so I think that's kind of the lasting gift that she left me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's super honorable. I thank you for sharing and being vulnerable to share that, because I'm sure that was a very traumatic experience for you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I love, how you took something that could have been it was traumatic, but could have really put you in a bad headspace, and you turned it and made it a positive. And now you're helping so many, burn survivors and their caregivers. So I know you are also the burn program coordinator at Johns Hopkins. So can you tell us a little bit more about your role in that position and how you help survivors and caregivers today?
Yeah. So here at the Hopkins Burn Center, we're very proud of the fact that we were one of the first burn centers that was verified by the American Burn Association. And we're also very proud of the fact that the nurses here were some of the first to be certified with the CBRN exam. So part of the work that has to get done in order to maintain those verifications, both from the ABA and now through BCEN for the CBRN exam, and also through our state accrediting agency, which is called MIMS, we have to do a lot of quality improvement and performance improvement work here. So a lot of my job is making sure that we are adhering to our policies and protocols that are in place in terms of providing quality care. So making sure that, one of the things that we look at, for example, is fluid resuscitation. So if we have a patient who comes in who needs a fluid resuscitation, one of the things I do is within 24 hours after they come, making sure they got the appropriate amount of fluid. And if they didn't get the appropriate amount of fluid, why not? Or, did they not need it because they had a heart condition, so we wanted to give them less? Or did they get more because someone made a calculation error? Or did they get more because they were hypotensive and they needed some extra fluid? So kind of looking at those metrics to make sure that we're doing what we should be doing. So that's a big part of my job, is doing a lot of chart reviews, doing a lot of education with our ICU and our step-down nurses to make sure, first of all, that they know when they're doing a good job, because I think that's honestly the most important thing. It's really easy to find mistakes and nitpick things in Monday morning quarterback. And that's not a great way to come in on your shift. Having been a bedside nurse myself, I know that coming in after a hard shift and seeing an email from my manager saying, hey, we need to talk, you didn't do X, Y, and Z, or you didn't document this pain assessment properly, is not a great way to start. So I always try to start with something great to support the nurses in that way, but also providing feedback when something's not done appropriately so that we can improve and make sure that we do improve. I also do a lot of research here. We have a lot of nurse-led research here at the Burn Center, which I'm very proud of. Some of that has to do with fluid resuscitation. My research specifically focuses on pain. We do a lot of work with sleep. I think you guys had Shira on, who's our psychologist, who does a lot of work with sleep, and a lot of the nursing staff here assists her with that. It's a very multidisciplinary team, as all burn centers are, but ours especially, we really focus on interdisciplinary teamwork as it relates to research. So I do a lot of that work as well. And then finally, education and making sure that our burn nurses are up to date on all the latest research, latest best practices, and updating our policies and procedures accordingly, so we make sure we're always at the forefront of burn care and doing the latest and greatest.
Oh, that was, thank you for that introduction and giving us an overview. That was a lot. So we will also put just a note, we'll put the episode about sleep in the show notes, because that was an awesome episode. I learned so much just from that episode alone about sleep for myself, someone who's not getting sleep. So definitely understand that. Yes. So I guess let's talk a little bit about your role. I want to take it back though to kind of you just told us a wonderful kind of story about how you got involved in the community, but I'm sure at the same time that can be really also a difficult thing for you to deal with kind of in your role, right? Because the reality of the situation is not every burn survivor has a positive outcome, which I think until I started really getting involved in the community through SOAR, we know that happens, but it's not something that I think we always think about. We have a chance to kind of reflect on that during, the World Burn Congress, where we, have our walk of solidarity, but it's definitely really difficult to kind of think about. But I'm sure in your role, it can be really hard for you, knowing kind of your history of what happened to your mom. I guess for a moment, if you could talk about yes, you have great parts of your job, but also how is dealing with knowing that was part of your story, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm very open about my story because I do think it's important for kind of newer nurses to understand where I come from, because the way that I approach burn survivors and their families is very different than someone who doesn't have a personal history. And so I am someone who is not only a burn nursing expert or subject matter expert, which feels weird to say, even though I've been doing this a long time. I'm also someone who identifies as a family member, and unfortunately not a survivor, but definitely someone who went through it. My mom had an inhalation injury, so we didn't have to go through surgeries and grafting and all that. Hers was a very quick course. That being said, I am someone who is adamant about respect and autonomy, not just for the families, but for the patients, obviously. But I also think that it's helped me in a way kind of reframe expectations about outcomes, because as you mentioned, not everyone has a good outcome. Unfortunately, burn injuries are fatal often. We still are in a place where a 98 or 100% burn is at this time with our current technology not survivable. And so that's just the reality that we have to live with. But that doesn't mean that there can't be good that comes out of that. I see my career and my research as part of that good. But one of the things that we tell referring hospitals all the time, and I tell our nurses here all the time, is that a good death is a really good thing for family members. And being able to provide comfort to family members is a really important part of what we do. And because we know how to take care of burn patients as they're dying and to make sure that they are comfortable, that they can speak with their family members if they're able to, that their family members can hold their hands, that they can be part of bathing or part of, getting ready for death, to make sure our chaplain, who's amazing, an amazing chaplain named Jo, who's, I can't even tell you how wonderful she is, to make sure that she's part of those conversations. There is such a thing as a good death, and there is such a thing as providing good end of life care, and we do that really well here, and I'm very proud of that work that we do here. And as I mentioned, we'll tell referring facilities all the time, they're like, it's not a survivable injury, we probably shouldn't transfer you. And I will often say, no, I think you should. And our attending will say the same, because we do end of life really well here. And we know, so for example, outside facilities oftentimes don't want to do any eschorotomies for patients with unsurvivable injuries. But we know here that an eschorotomy, it can be a relief of pain. And we know that it can relieve labored breathing, which is obviously uncomfortable for someone who's dying. we know that there are things we can do to help ease suffering at the end of life. And that's not just for the patients, but for the families. And so I kind of reframed the way that I think about a burn fatality can look for people. It's a horrible thing. Someone has to go through. I know that myself firsthand, but there's good that can come out of it. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I hate to, that's very corny, but it's true for
Right.
families. If we can provide them that closure to start the grieving process, it allows them to grieve in a healthier way. Sometimes, not always. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you saying that, because I know we talk a lot about survivorship on this podcast, but there is that really sad reality of, like you mentioned, like burns are not always survivable. And even if you've survived the initial injury, that doesn't mean you're necessarily out of, or that instance of trauma. Like, there's still the reality that folks may not make it. And that, that's a hard thing that we don't talk about a lot. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that is a really important thing, or important for me to bring light to, because I think we just assume that it's a thing that you can overcome always. And that doesn't always happen. And that is the harsh reality, like you said, of burns, and why we advocate so much for even just safe measures, right? So that we can try to help prevent things like this from happening.
Yeah. And I think it's important for family members to know also, even if it's a non-survivable injury, maybe especially if it's a non-survivable injury, they need to know the resources that are available to survivors, because although they're not survivors of burn injuries, they are survivors of a burn fatality in a way. So they need to know about support group, and they need to know about PTSD and how to manage it if they have it. And not just the financial resources that they need if they lose their house from the Red Cross, but also the emotional resources that we can offer them here in a burn center.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We say it all the time, a burn affects the entire family.
The whole family.
It's like you said, I mean, even if you're not the survivor and you're a caregiver, you're still a survivor of that injury because your life has been impacted as well.
In many cases too, like maybe the survivor, right? Like did not, the survivor as the caregiver may have had the injury or may have been right close nearby, right? So maybe they didn't directly have a burn, but you were there for the incident. I know in my case, my husband was directly there during my injury. And so while he didn't experience the pain that I felt, he did visually see it happen. And in many cases, right, the survivor's caregiver may have been there for the accident. And that is just as traumatic, if not more, from what I believe, than maybe having the injury itself, right? I wouldn't have wanted to have been in my husband's position in that instance. So like you mentioned, Rachel, I think it's really important that we call light to that too, of like survivors, caregivers of those who have survived and maybe who have not are always welcome to our community. And I think that's really important. I've personally been on calls where caregivers have joined because they really don't know how to approach a survivor or approach really the situation in general. So I think that's an important thing that we talk about today, because I do think that was a thing that I didn't even realize, like nurses have to go through, right? Nurses aren't just caring for those that survive. Right. Nurses are caring for that too. And we do have a lot of caregivers, but also we have a lot of healthcare professionals that listen to our podcast. And so nurses see it all. And I think that's an important thing that we don't always realize as survivors too.
And there's this idea of kind of, I'm going to mess the phrase up here. My brain is a little tired too. Something like it's either
I'm glad it's not just me.
Secondary. No, it's not just you. It's either called associated trauma or secondary trauma, but it's essentially the idea that people who aren't primarily touched by the traumatic event, so not the burn survivor, but the families, but also since we're talking about nurses, but nurses, this is a hard job. Burn nursing is, in my opinion, obviously I'm very biased because I identify as a burn nurse. Burn nursing is, I think, the toughest kind of nursing that there is in the entire world. And I will fight to the death anybody who disagrees with me. It is so hard because not only are you dealing with incredibly difficult critical care, incredibly difficult wound care, incredibly difficult, all the things that have to be done in order to take care of patients who are so sick. You're also dealing with the traumatic events that surround these injuries, right? So you have patients who come in who you're dealing with all of their stuff, and then their family is in the waiting room trying to figure out where they're going to sleep tonight because their house is burned down and all of their kids' toys are gone and the kid is crying and the mom is really sick or the dad is really sick. And there's all this chaos, just absolute chaos surrounding. And that takes a toll on nurses because we can't just block that out because we are taking care of, just like, the Phoenix Society. I know you guys say this all the time, it really does affect the whole family. The burn injury and the chaos surrounding that affect the nursing staff and the physicians and surgeons who are taking care of them as well. So that we are constantly trying to deal with that and trying to manage our own stress levels. And we tell the new nurses, like self-care is so important. It's so important to be able to turn off when you're done here and figure out what can we do to take care of ourselves in a way, because that secondary trauma is really, it's very real. There's a lot of good research coming out about, especially after COVID, what that did to nurses, what that did to doctors, and how we can move forward from that.
Definitely. Because I was going to ask you about that too, of, how do you prevent burnout and take care of yourself? And what advice do you have for, burn care nurses or any healthcare professional
any nurse in general, right? Yeah. I think for me, I am a very mission-driven person, which is why Hopkins has always been a good fit for me, because Hopkins is a mission-driven organization. And for me, the mission for myself has always been to leave a legacy, honestly. That's why I've been so involved in the CBRN exam, because it's so important for me to look back when I retire and, oh my gosh, probably 30 years and say, I did something that mattered, and I did something that other nurses and other patients and other families are going to benefit from. That's really important to me. It's also important to me that I do something that I love. I am so lucky that I get to come to work every day and do a job that I love. It's a hard job. It's a really hard job. And when I was bedside, I'm not at the bedside anymore, although I still teach clinical, so I'm there with my students sometimes. It's a physically demanding job too, right? So you have to love what you do. If you don't love what you do, you shouldn't do it, because it's too hard a job to do it if you don't love it. And this is what I tell my students, and what I tell newer nurses now too, that you can't be a nurse for the money. It's a decent salary most of the time, and a lot of people go into it thinking, oh, I'm going to go make a lot of money, and the money is never going to be enough for what you do. You have to do it because you love it. That doesn't mean it has to be a calling for everybody like it was for me. I know that it's not for everybody, and that's fine. But you have to love some part of it enough to want to come in every day, because if you don't love it, you're not going to be providing the kind of care that our patients need. And burn nurses in particular have patients. I have patients who invite me to their weddings after they've left. It's like,
that's amazing
thing in the world. Like getting an invitation to a wedding from a burn survivor. I hope she's listening to the show. I think she does. Was literally one of the highlights of my life.
That's amazing.
It's burn nurses form these relationships. You guys know this with burn patients and burn survivors and their families that last for the rest of their lives. And so if you don't love it, you don't really have any business doing it. Honestly, it's something you have to.
I think specifically this specialty, right? Like kind of like what you talked about. Like I do feel like nursing in other areas there may be more joy, right? Or maybe more positive outcomes, I guess we could say, right? Like specifically, I'm thinking about, like, I just had a son. I'm sure being a nurse in a neonatal or in some instances there, but in pediatric or whatnot, like there may be more positive outcomes, I think, especially if you're an OB, like nurse. But I feel like in this area, right, a lot of this is like there's trauma, like heavy all the time, right? It's always some sort of trauma. I feel like there's never not trauma, right? For you guys, like it's usually what happened. So I do think that's such an important piece of advice for other nurses out there of don't go into this if you're expecting there to be always sunshine, right? Or more sunshine than there's not.
It's not an easy job. It's not, but this is something we talk about. We had a campaign a few years ago here. It's called Finding the Joy in Medicine. And that's kind of what you're talking about. There's not always a lot of joy in burn care, right? Because we do have fatalities. We do have horrible traumatic injuries, life-changing, life-altering, limb-altering, all these sorts of injuries, right? But there is always a place that you can find joy in nursing, but specifically in burn nursing. You have to celebrate the little wins. You have to pass. You have to celebrate the swallow test. When you finally pass, like, you're gonna go and get your Chick-fil-A that day. I promise you. When you go, these little victories are things that we have to. The first time you stand up, the entire unit is going to be on the floor cheering for you. The first time that we have all your staples out, like all of them, that's right. That's a big deal, and we have to celebrate those little victories.
We also just had a burn services coordinator on our show, and she talked about the little miracles every day. And I think that is so important, because that is, especially with burns, like, there are little, like, the miracle of the day she says she brings. And it's so true, right? Like, there are so many little things. And I see all the time, like, survivors get really overwhelmed with, like, oh my gosh, I just had my injury, and, like, the future is so crazy, right? There's so much to think about, but that can make your journey very overwhelming. I know, like, my husband's thing was always like, we're gonna I have to get through my dressing changes tonight, and I would get so overwhelmed with the future that I would, like, kind of forget to look at today. And I think that's really, really important, of, like, let's take it one day, maybe even 1 hour, right? Like, because there were days where it was like, oh my gosh, this itching is uncontrollable. I don't know what I'm going to do. And my husband was like, let's get through tonight, right? If we can get through tonight, then tomorrow will be okay. So I do think that's really important to kind of look at the outlook of, like, we need to get through that, minute by minute, and celebrate even the small, like you said, the staples out. Like, if I can get through that dressing change, I'll be okay. And that was kind of how I took it. Yeah. Completely understand that. Well, I think I really appreciate the vulnerability, because I think it is a very challenging job. I want to take a moment and maybe talk a little bit about kind of from a survivor standpoint. I know I always had a million questions for my nurses, and they always offered some great advice. I'd love for a moment to let's pause there and talk about, like, the advice that you give survivors, because I do think you probably have some great advice to offer. Any specific things that may be sticking out, or even, I know you talked earlier about your research. Like, let's talk a little bit about kind of things that you're working on, or things that you've found through maybe some of that research.
Sure. So in terms of kind of advice for survivors, I don't have great advice, because I've never been there. I think the best advice I can give is go to your SOAR groups, go to your support groups, rely on the resources of the Phoenix Society, because I am as an educator, I'm a big believer in experiential learning. And that's kind of my background. And I think that if I, as a person, have not personally experienced a burn injury, I am not the person to be telling you how to go and live your life now. But I know some people who can tell you that, and they're in support group on Tuesdays. And you should talk to them, because they're amazing people, and they have amazing families. And we have a fantastic Brooke Dean, who, if you guys haven't talked to her, you should meet her, because she's amazing. She runs our support group here. She's one of our therapists here in the Burn Center. She is a wealth of information. She does a lot of stuff with, she did her training with, kind of the makeup, and also running the support group. And she's an amazing resource. And really, the support group is where it's at. I mean, we try to encourage our patients to start going to support group while they're still inpatient, so that before they leave, they already know, okay, on Tuesdays, I'm going to go to the conference room, and that's what I'm going to do. And we'll try to encourage them, make your therapy appointments on Tuesday, so you can go to support group afterwards, or before, or whatever it is. Because that group is just, no one understands a burn injury like a survivor. I can tell you all the pathophysiology of a burn injury, and tell you all about my research about pain. That is not really going to help you learn how to navigate what happens when a 6-year-old in the grocery store points at you and says, "What's that?" That is an experience that I have not lived myself. And I have so much respect for people who have, and I would never try to take that experience away from them. That's that's their area of expertise, not mine.
Mm-hmm.
So go to your support groups. That's what I would say. They're a great place. And also like any kind of events that the Burn Center has for survivors, I think are such a great place to meet people who don't go to support group. Because some people don't feel comfortable at support group, and I know that. And that's okay. You don't have to feel comfortable at support group, but come to the Christmas party. And you can still hang out and get the kind of fellowship with other burn survivors, or come to the bowling nights or whatever it is that your local burn center or your local Phoenix Society, your local sword group, whatever it is doing, so that you can be part of that community, because community is so important for reintegration, especially for our younger school age kids and for our teenagers who are just figuring out who they are in the world. Like, it's really, you got to be part of the community to have a successful reintegration after your hospital stay.
I think that's so important, because you get to see somebody who's like, looks like you, right? Like, I know I'll never forget the first time I saw somebody that looked like me. I like hit my husband like, oh my gosh, that person looks like me. And it's so refreshing. And the feeling that you get for somebody else that you may not have had exposure to it. And I think that's, like you said, there are times where I don't feel like support, right? Like, I'm just not prepared for that today, and I just can't go there. But maybe I can talk with Rachel, right? Or another survivor, because I know at the end of the day, we don't have to talk about my burns, but Rachel and I both understand what we went through and can at least like resonate with one another and have a good conversation and know like, hey, we've both been through something traumatic. And so we have that respect for one another when we're not feeling like I'm not feeling like talking about that today, but let's just talk because I know you get it and you understand. So I think that's a really great point to make of, you don't always have to have support to be in. You
don't, you just have to know where to reach out and to make those little connections everywhere you can with the people who, will have your back all the time.
And, this is a little bit too of why we work so hard in our advocacy for like proper media representation, but just seeing survivors in the wild, thriving and living life can be such a powerful moment, especially for survivors who are still in the hospital, who I get it, don't want to talk about the injury or how they're feeling, but when you can see that there is life after the burn injury, it's just such a powerful moment.
Do not get me started on the media representation of burn injuries, because
it's not good.
I really wish that some producers from some shows that I will not name would just come and talk to us in the burn community so we can tell them, please stop doing this. And
we've made some progress, but I still think there's a really long way to go, unfortunately. I think that's really why, and you reminded me too, we talk a lot on this episode, on this podcast, about kind of representation, and staring is something that comes up a lot, right? And we had this great conversation on one of our previous episodes about like, folks don't always stare because they are nosy or because they're staring. They may be staring because they have a loved one who looks just like that, and they also have never seen it. I think Rachel, was it you that brought up like somebody in a grocery store like was staring, and the reason they were staring is because they were so astounded by how wonderful that person was able to carry themselves and be able to present themselves out in the world, and they wish that their loved one was able to see that. So sometimes they stared not because, right, like not for the approach of, oh my goodness, that person looks a certain way. It's more of, I think, being able to share our scars proudly. I know for me, like, I have no shame with wearing a bathing suit, and I hope that, right, maybe someone comes over and says, oh my gosh, like, I wish my loved one, right, was able to carry themselves that way. And so I think it's important to remember that like we are a representation of ourselves, right? So being able to share the community and not be ashamed of ours.
And I will say that sometimes when I see a burn survivor in the wild, and I will catch myself because I'm like trying so hard not to stare, because I'm like, don't stare, don't be the jerk who's staring. But I'm like, that is a beautiful graft. I'm wondering who your surgeon is. Like, did you? And also sometimes, I've been doing this for so long that sometimes this happened to me at Target not that long ago. I out of the corner of my eye looking at someone who had a forearm graft, and it was a sheet graft, and it was gorgeous. Like if I had not been a burn nurse, I would not have noticed it. But I'm like out of the corner of my eye, like, oh my gosh, that is a beautiful graft. Like that is a beautiful result. Like full function. This is a beautiful graft. I wonder who did this. And the person comes over and is like, Emily? And I'm like, do I know you? And I was taking care of them. I didn't remember. And I was like, oh. And they didn't notice that I was looking, thankfully. But it's so funny. Like, we all have it's human nature to notice the difference. To steer. Right?
Yeah,
to see that. And so one of the things, I have young kids, that one of the things that's been super important for me is not just a burn nurse and someone who advocates for the burn community, but as a mom, is to have my kids around survivors from the time they were babies. Mm-hmm. So my kids have been to every burn Christmas party we've had, except from COVID, because we couldn't. But they have been around burn survivors their whole lives. And so they are now definitely advocates in their own right with their friends, so that if they see someone who, and that doesn't just apply to burns, that's anyone who's different, right? We respect differences. That's what we do. And you can notice it. You don't have to comment on it, right? That's what I tell them. You can notice it. Don't comment on it unless someone invites you to comment on it, right?
And I think that's great advice. Yeah, that's great advice as someone who, right, is in the community and can help with how to teach your kids or how to talk to your kids about it. Because I think sometimes it's really difficult. And we've had all sorts of folks on this podcast, and some of them, right, are like, I don't know what to tell my kids or how to talk to them. And so, I think as a survivor, I welcome feedback, right? And I welcome, like, if your kid wants to come up to me and say, what's that? Like, I will, but not everybody is comfortable with sharing that. Right. And so I think it's, that's a really nice approach as a mom to be like, you know what, we're not going to always want to talk about it.
Yeah. And my son has very, very blonde hair, like white blonde hair. Right. And he doesn't like it when people comment on it. Right. And so I tell him, if you don't like someone commenting on the color of your hair, imagine
the skin,
how you would feel if it was all your skin and somebody coming up to you and you're having, and like you say, there's some survivors who don't mind at all and like talking about it. But sometimes you're just having a bad day and maybe didn't sleep all night and you just need to get some coffee and you don't want to educate somebody, you know?
Yeah, and you want to go fill up with coffee because I'm tired that day, right? And I don't want to have that conversation.
It's not your job to educate everybody all the time, right? And so that's one of, and we tell visitors to the burn center here, this is why I tell my students this as well. It's not anyone else's job to educate you. That is your own job. You are responsible for your education. And so it is not the job of the burn survivor to educate you on their injury. That is personal. And you don't know the circumstances of their injury. It's often traumatic. It's none of your business. Unless it relates to their medical care, it's none of your business. And so that's something that I think is important for nurses to understand too, that we're not entitled to other people's trauma. That's their trauma.
That's very important. Yeah.
Yeah. And going back, Amber, to your comment about the grocery store, that was Michelle when we had her on. Right. So we'll make sure we have that episode linked below as well, so folks can listen to that conversation. Yeah. But
Michelle talked about how she was in the grocery store and had seen somebody staring at her and was like, what? And was like annoyed by it, right? Like, this is not, but the person ended up having a loved one, and that like changed her or reframed her thinking. And it's funny because we don't always think about that. I think we always just are on the defense as survivors because there have been negative experiences that maybe we have had. That doesn't have to be the case every time. And we have to try to remind ourselves that it's not, especially like in your case, right? It was, you were just really impressed with how good that skin graft. And I find myself doing that too, of like, whoa, that person has a really cool skin graft. Like I wish mine looked that good. But we just have to remember that. So yes, thank you, Rachel, for reminding me. My brain, as we know today, is just not always there.
Well, Emily, I do want to switch gears a little bit because I want to make sure we talk a little bit about the nursing certification from BEN. So that's Board of Certification for Emergency Nursing. Well, one, let's just start. I know you're on their board of directors. So can you just tell us more about that organization and your role with them?
Yeah. So the Board of Certification for Emergency Nursing, which is BCEN, it's a mouthful. It's a great organization that provides credentialing, or I should say credentialing certification exams for all sorts of different nursing specialties. So they have certifications for all different types of emergency nurses. So flight nurses, emergency nurses, pediatric emergency nurses, all that sort of thing. And as burn nursing has kind of developed as a specialty, there was really a lot of work that started, honestly, with Gretchen Carroll out of Seattle and Katie Holloway, who's now at South Carolina, really started thinking about the need for a burn nursing certification because it is a specialty. And so several years ago, the ABA and Gretchen and Katie really kind of spearheaded that, reached out to BCEM because we knew that they had experience with these certification exams and said, hey, we really want to do a burn nursing exam. And they said, slow your roll. The first thing you need to do is be classified as a specialty through the American Nurses Association. And so there was a lot of work that went on with that. That involved creating, in addition to getting that certification, we had to create a core curriculum for burn nurses, really set a standard of what a burn nurse does. And once we had done that, we went back with BCEN and did the first part of the work was doing this thing they call a role delineation study. I've learned so much in this whole process. And what that meant was we all got together as a group and kind of defined, what does a burn nurse do? A burn nurse doesn't just do dressings, right? A burn nurse does critical care, a burn nurse does advocacy, a burn nurse does research, a burn nurse does family support, all these things. And then once that had happened, we started writing the exam using that role delineation to come up with, what we thought the exam content should be, and then started writing the questions and then did all the testing to make sure the test was appropriate and valid and reliable. So I helped write some of the questions and now sit on the committee that reviews the exam as a whole to make sure that it's testing what we want it to test, that it's valid, that it's reliable, that the content is in keeping with the content outline that we did at that first role delineation and then the content creation. And then also sit on the board of directors now as well to kind of be the voice for the CBRN exam, but also for kind of emergency nurses in general. Not all emergency nurses are burn nurses, not all burn nurses are emergency nurses, sort of the same as trauma, but we all play in the same sandbox, so to speak. And so it's a really exciting role. It's a really exciting time to be a burn nurse. This is, the first generation of certified burn nurses. It's so exciting to see the work validated by the ANA and now by BCN to say, yes, you are a specialty. Yes, you are an expert at this. So it's been really exciting working with them and exciting to see people signing up for the test and passing it. And I'm really excited to come to see everybody as the years go on and all the different conferences and different gatherings that we come to see all the different, CBRNs as we progress through our careers.
So what does that mean for, I guess, the world of, burn survivors or really this community? Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the standards, I guess, that are in that certification? I know you may not be able to talk about all of it, but what does that mean?
Yeah. So the certification there's similar certifications that people may be more familiar with in the CBRN. So there's the TCRN, which is the trauma certified nurse, and then there's the CBRN. Basically, all of those exams test knowledge of that specialty. So the burn exam tests knowledge of, do you know the pathophysiology of burns? Do you know why burns respond this way? Do you know how to treat a burn? Like what kind of topical should you put on this? When do you need to call a surgeon because a topical's not going to fix this? How do you take care of grafts? That's a really important part of the exam. And the other important part that I think is really unique to the burn exam is, what are you doing in the community? Because burn nursing does not stop in the burn unit. Burn nursing involves prevention, it involves advocacy, it involves family support after the injury. So there are a lot of questions about prevention and advocacy, which you do not see in other exams to the extent you see them on the CBRN exam. And so as a patient, as a family member, as a survivor, I think when you see the CBRN, you can probably maybe see it behind me on my pin, on my coat there. When you see the CBRN pin, what that should indicate to you is that the person who has that pin, who has passed that exam, which is a really rigorous exam, and has obtained that credential is someone who is an expert in that field, someone who knows the latest research, someone who reads journals regularly and knows what to do and what not to do, and also someone who's taken the time to obtain that, right? Because there are plenty of people who have that knowledge who are like, I don't need to take an exam. The person who goes and takes a CBRN is someone who not only says, hey, look, I have all this knowledge, but also says, I want other people to know that I have this knowledge. I want to validate this for my own professional development, my own career goals. And I want everyone to know that I'm an expert in burn nursing. It's really exciting for burn nurses to be able to do this. We haven't been able to do so. I would always be a little upset, honestly, when I saw the people with the CCRN and the TCRN, and like, I could have sat for the CCRN exam. I'm a critical care nurse. I could have done it. I was waiting for the burn nurse because that is where I live. That's my heart. And so I wanted the CBRN. And so I think as I said, as patients, as families, as survivors, as caregivers, when you see that, you know that it's the mark of someone who's done the work and is continuing to do the work. Same with an ABA verified hospital. You know, when you are looking for reconstruction and you're looking for where you're going down the line, you know that if you're going to an ABA verified burn center, they're adhering to certain qualities and standards of care. That's the same with the CBRN. You know that this is someone who's doing things the way that they should be done and is committed to doing that.
Yeah.
I think that's great to understand, because I do, like, anytime someone, being in the community, you get questions all the time of like, I was burned, where do I go? I always refer them to like the ABA, like, go on this list and don't go to a hospital that doesn't have this certification. I mean, go to hospital if you need it, but like, please go to hospital if you need it. But when they're always asking me like, where should I go? I'm always like, this is what I would recommend, because this is the list of certified. So it's really a great way to put it, I think, because that is definitely a standard that we all want to achieve.
What I tell family members and friends who ask me about it is, I'm like, okay, you know how like you're on Facebook or X or whatever, and you see like the blue check mark.
Yes.
That's what the CBRN is. It's the check mark. They're legit.
Yes. So let's talk about, if I'm a nurse and I want the blue check mark, how do I get that?
So there are a couple ways to do it. There are first and foremost, be a burn nurse. You have to have the experience, I think, to answer some of these questions successfully. Be someone who's practicing in the burn world. I'm not saying that you have to be a burn ICU nurse, or you have to be we have our step-down unit called the burn wound unit, which is full of fantastic nurses. I'm not saying you have to be someone who works all the time in a burn wound unit. You can be someone who works in outpatient space with burns. You can be someone who works in the pre-hospital setting as a nurse. But you have to have some familiarity with burns in order to take the test. There are some prep materials available. The American Burn Association has some links. I can't obviously endorse or say anything about those. But I know that there are prep courses available. Many hospitals are offering prep courses in their burn centers or study groups. I would say get together with your burn nurse friends. Because just as community is important for survivors, it's important for nurses. So there's a great nursing forum on the American Burn Association website. Get together a virtual group of study friends, because burn centers are small places usually. We're a pretty decent sized burn center here. We still don't have a ton of nurses on staff, so sometimes it's hard to find somebody to study with. So, turn to that group that we have with the American Burn Association. You can definitely create your own study groups there. But you are going to have to study for this test. It is not an easy test. It's rigorous. It's designed to be rigorous. And so you want to study as best you can. And then you sign up on the BCEN website and go to, I think you can do it at home or a testing center. And then take the test, and fingers crossed. But you have to hold an active license, an active nursing license. And if you want some more information specifically on the requirements, the BCEN website has all of those listed.
Well, thank you. And we'll make sure we have those listed in our show notes as well. I'm really excited. I mean, obviously I'm not a nurse, but I'm really excited that this certification, was launched last year, because, we talked a little bit about earlier, burnout in all of healthcare is real, especially in the burn care field. Yeah. And I hope that this, this kind of like, I guess, like builds the cred of burn care in a way. Yeah. And I hope that this inspires even more folks to get involved in the field.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be a burn nurse, really. And, we were talking about these little victories. Like, I think, this is another way nurses need to celebrate those little victories too. And so celebrating with other nurses as they get their CBRNs has been really exciting to see the nurses here who maybe I was their preceptor on orientation, and now they've got their CBRN. I'm like a proud mama. It's so exciting to see them all thriving and getting the certification.
Definitely.
That's awesome.
Well, I know we're coming up on time, but I do want to quickly ask before we wrap up today, just a little bit, if you could give us maybe a quick overview of some of the research you've been working on. I know you're also a PhD candidate, which is amazing. And you've been working on, like I read in your bio, that relationship between burn pain and childhood adversity. So if you could just talk a few minutes about that, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I'm actually defending my dissertation in, like, I'm looking at the calendar, 17 days. So that's why my brain is a little, so
no pressure, right?
No pressure. Yeah, not at all. It's totally fine. So my research is really focused, obviously I love burns, and that's what I wanted my dissertation to focus on. And so the impetus for my research was really talking with patients over the years and recognizing that I was seeing this kind of anecdotal relationship between people who had had really tough childhoods and pain that was really difficult to manage. And what I found was that people who had really tough childhoods, they were taking more pain medicine. They were needing more pain medicine. And so I was thinking about this as I was doing my PhD coursework and thinking, I wonder if there's some sort of connection here, right? And so that's really what my dissertation focuses on is there a correlation between adversity in childhood, which is measured by something called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and there's a score. It's a really easy 10-item tool. Is there a correlation between that and burn pain? And so I started by looking at some chronic pain patients to see if there was a relationship between their ACE score and their chronic pain scores, which is using something called the GCPS, the Graded Chronic Pain Scale Score. And it turns out there's a very direct, positive, linear relationship. So, if you have your ACE score is up here, then your pain score is also going to be up here, right? They kind of predict one another, or I should say the ACE score predicts the pain. And so that's been really interesting to look at. And then the other thing that I've looked at with that is this idea of catastrophizing, which is something I noticed in these patients, that they always thought the pain was always going to be a 10. Even if the pain wasn't a 10, they were anticipating it was going to be a 10. So if I would say to them, how do you think it's going to go today? And they'd go, worse than yesterday. It's going to be terrible. I don't even know why we're doing this. And I'm like, okay, all right. And so my research also looks at this concept of catastrophizing, and does that play a role? And so I did some work with that, and it turns out that it does. So it mediates that relationship. So it kind of amplifies the pain and makes it even worse. Which I'm sure you guys as survivors know this, that if you're expecting your pain's going to be terrible, it's going to be terrible. And that's not just an optimistic or pessimistic kind of thing. There is actually some real science that shows us that if you expect pain's going to be bad, pain will be worse than if you expect it's not going to be bad. And so kind of the next step in my research is going to be another study looking at acute pain. And this idea of childhood adversity. We're in a really unique position here in Baltimore, unfortunately, because there's, I don't know if you guys have heard of this concept of something called the black butterfly, which is in Baltimore, there's a big highway that runs up the middle of the city like this. And on either side of it, it's in the shape of a butterfly, or these neighborhoods that are kind of economically depressed, have food deserts, or tough neighborhoods. And so unfortunately, Baltimore is in a really unique position to be able to study childhood adversity, because we do have a lot of kids who experience it. And a lot of our patients who are a product of these neighborhoods in the black butterfly. And so that'll be kind of the next step of my research, is looking at kids and adults who are products of that neighborhood, and how their pain is when they get acute burn pain, if it's more severe or if it's just an anecdotal relationship that I've been noticing. So,
Well, I love learning about research. I could never conduct it, or, I can't read the journals or the papers, but when you can give me a quick recap like that, it's so interesting. And, I'm excited to learn more about your future studies.
Yeah, there's, I'm happy to share with you guys some stuff that's already been published, but there's, I published a literature review last year, a year and a half ago. There's really some interesting research about these ACEs and this whole concept. And I think it's really fascinating for burn patients, because there are actually biological changes that happen in your body in childhood if you have, consistent stress. And that makes the way that you function as an adult fundamentally different. And so as nurses, we need to be able to treat those patients. So we have to, you can't do something about it if you don't know about it. So that's another big goal of my research, is kind of making sure nurses know about ACEs, and knowing that if your patient has had a rough childhood, even if they're adult, that impacts them every day of their life. And trauma-informed care is a huge part of what we do. And I think the more we learn about this, the more we'll learn that everyone needs to be using trauma-informed care with every patient. It can't hurt.
I think that's really important. I know. So I actually got my certification as a yoga instructor many years ago. And there is a trauma-informed certification for yoga. And I know it's not the same, but I think it's really important. Even just as a yoga teacher, I think everyone should have to go through the trauma-informed, because you never know what someone is holding in, right? So even if you have to have a certification to teach a trauma-informed class, really every class should be a trauma-informed class, in my opinion. There are, you never know when someone walks into your classroom and they may not want to disclose that they've had trauma-informed, right? They've had trauma.
Yeah.
So being able to teach with the trauma-informed approach, I think, is really important, because you're approaching the situation in a way knowing that person may have dealt with something difficult and they may not always want to talk about it. So it's important, I think, for you to kind of approach a situation that way. So I completely understand. Well, I know, Emily, we are definitely coming up on time here, and we always ask 2 final questions. I've really kind of asked our first question already, so I'm going to switch it up today. I think it's important that you're a healthcare professional. You're also an advocate for the burn community, but you're also, you have a personal connection with our community. So dealing with, going into work every day is probably very challenging, and there's probably a level of burnout, right, that we have to avoid. So how do you, as all of those things, handle your role, and what do you do to kind of take care of yourself to avoid that burnout? And maybe whatever you do, maybe there's a recommendation for other burn care professionals to help with avoiding burnout.
Well, what do? I listen to very loud music on the way home from work and decompress. I sing loudly with the windows down. And my husband can tell it's been a bad day if I get home and I'm a little hoarse, because I've been really belting it out in the car on the way home. I do a lot of very loud, very bad singing in my car.
Who doesn't love? I love having karaoke concerts in my car too.
It's terrible, but also just I have a best friend at work. That's really important, to have somebody that I can, and not just we're very good friends outside of work. We're best friends at work. She's someone who I can say, oh my gosh, there's 400 loads of laundry that need to get done tonight, and I have to finish this policy update by tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And she understands both of those, right? She understands both the laundry and the fact that this policy needs to get done, because she knows what I'm talking about. So having a best friend at work, I think, is so crucial. Top tier. I highly recommend.
Somebody that understands what you're going through, I think, is important, right? It's always great to have a support system, both at home and at work. So,
definitely. It's great advice. So our final question today, it is our Phoenix Partner question, which today is sponsored by Johns Hopkins Medicine, headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, improving the health of the community and the world. So the question from them today is, what is one thing that always brings a smile to your face, no matter how tough your day has been?
This is terrible. The first thing that comes to my head is a fresh, very cold Coke Zero.
You know what's funny, Emily, is I just recently started drinking Coke Zero myself. And at the end of the day, sometimes I'm like, ooh, like I could just really use a nice crisp Coke Zero to have with my
crisp Coke Zero. I will also say I am a reality TV.
Yes.
You're speaking to our hearts.
This podcast is all about, let's hear what you're watching. We have
Below Deck, obviously Below Deck, because Eddie is from Baltimore, like one of the original Below Deck guys is from Baltimore. And my best friend at work, who I was just talking about, is also a huge, so, you know, there's a lot of texting that happens late at night about Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and basically anything Bravo.
I love Bravo.
To my face.
I was gonna say Rachel is a Bravo junkie herself.
Yeah,
so
that's terrible. I probably should have said like my kids, my husband. No, it's Coke Zero and Bravo.
It's Coke Zero and Bravo. I get it.
As a new mom myself, like
you get it.
How do I, at the end of the day, how do I decompress from everything I've dealt with? Usually there's a Coke Zero. Sometimes there's some cheese pizza and a lot. And then there's usually a lot of reality TV. My husband doesn't always approve. He's always like, can we watch something else? But no, that's like the only way that I can like get rid of all of the things that have happened in the day. And sometimes just being a mom is hard. And so I'm like, I just need to sit and watch some trash TV for an hour. So I completely understand.
Sometimes I feel like a better parent after watching the parenting decisions made on reality TV. I'm like, I'm crushing this.
Definitely not something I do.
No, it is nice to see someone else's has a bigger mess to deal with than I do. So like, I'm
just
doing
has
better
their
than
life all over the place a little bit more. Like, oh, yes, I have a lot of laundry, but you know what? This person has a lot more problems than that load of laundry I've got right now.
Yeah,
so
I just told my husband the other day, I told him that the laundry room looks like there was a terrible, like our laundry room at home, like it looks like there's a terrible third stew on this spot. And I don't know what to do about it, but here's where we are. So
yeah.
I don't know. Hire new stew. I don't know what to tell you.
I love that. I love it.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today, Emily. Thank you for all the wisdom and vulnerability you've brought to our podcast. We really appreciate it. And so we wish you a very happy Nurses Day once again. And thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I hope to see you guys at some Phoenix Society or American Burn Association events coming up soon.
Yes,
we
definitely.
do.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye, Emily.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.